Bueno, muy buenas tardes a todos y todas. Complacidos de tener el salón casi lleno. También a los internautas que nos acompañan. Estamos transmitiendo este seminario por ejemplo. Simplemente les quería decir que este es el primer seminario de un esfuerzo conjunto que está haciendo EFD, el capítulo latinoamericano que está organizando y el Centro para los Objetivos de Desarrollo Sostenible. Nuestro plan es hacer un seminario como este los últimos lunes de cada mes. Y estamos muy complacidos de tener al profesor Pfaff que nos acompañe en el lanzamiento de nuestro conjunto. Muchas gracias por estar aquí. Por Alejandra. Te voy a presentar a muchas gracias a todos.
Bueno, muchas gracias a todos por estar acá. Yo solamente quería presentar a Alex Pfaff. Maybe I should switch to English because the conference is going to be in English. Alex Pfaff is a professor at the Stanford School of Public Policy at Duke University. He's a very prominent voice in environmental and development economics literature, a professor and mentor of many of us in Latin America. So we are very happy to have you here again. This is our third visit to Colombia. Nothing else to say, Alex.
Okay.
This is an informal talk, even though it's with a streaming and microphone, so please feel free to ask questions during the talk and at the end, right?
Thank you, Alejandro. Yes, let me emphasize what Maria Alejandra said. I already know what I'm going to say. You don't. And the point is for me to communicate. And sometimes, as Maria Alejandra will tell you, I talk too fast. So please, for any reason, interrupt me, ask questions. I'm sure you're not the only person with that question, as I always say in class. So you'll be doing somebody else a favor. And I only have so many slides, so you need to help me fill the time. But that said, there's a lot of different papers I will present. I have no idea exactly how this will work because there's a new center focused on the SDGs. I thought I would try more of an opinion talk, combining papers and less of just one paper. We'll see how it goes. I'm really happy to be back at Los Andes. This is actually my 10th anniversary at Los Andes. I was here for La Fen, and every time it's productive and I have fun and great interactions, so thank you all for coming. I'm also delighted to be here with EFD, the Environment for Development Network. It's a fantastic network trying to build capacity around the world for doing environmental and economic analysis to support policy. And thank you for supporting this trip. And just delighted that there is a cause, a Center for the Sustainable Development Goals in Latin America, and that's the motivation for what I'll talk about today. I think it's a huge challenge, an important one, and having a network of universities in Latin America, South America is just a superb idea. So that's really my motivation for my opinion talk. I'm firmly convinced that achieving all the SDGs is a huge challenge, or perhaps a huge suite of challenges. I'm a coordinating lead author in the IPBES, which is like IPCC, and for sure the chapter that's going to say, are we going to make all these goals like Aichi and the SDGs, is going to say we're not going to make them all on our current path. So we need to change something. And from my point of view, in the end, we're going to have to lower the trade-offs, because SDGs have purely developmental goals, environmental goals, and they all interact. So we really want to lower the trade-offs. Can we get our environment with a lower development cost? Can we get our development with a lower environment cost? Like, we need to go in that efficiency direction. And even find the synergies. Does promoting urban growth, which is an engine for economic development, is that actually good for forests in the countryside? Where do we get win-wins? Right? If we don't find those efficiencies, it's going to be even harder and maybe not possible. So I see it as a massive challenge for thinking about learning from research, which is very much the point of this institution, all three of these institutions, and thinking about application to policy. So actually the point I'm going to emphasize is unbelievably simple. The only problem is we don't actually do it in the real world. So I'm going to try to argue that we have plenty of evidence that there's potential to do better planning, in particular integrating our development planning and our conservation planning. Historically, I think we basically do those separately. We've got our economic development planners, we've got our environmental planners, and they're not always coordinated. And I think one line for this talk is there's huge inefficiencies when we do not coordinate development and environment. So these blue lines here, I think, are two obviously true things that give us an opportunity to do better. First, heterogeneous impacts. If you take a development policy like a road or like a property right, the impacts in one setting are very different from the impacts in another setting. That gives us a chance to impacts on the forest. Also true for the impacts on the economy. So both development and environmental outcomes vary a lot from a development policy. Same thing's true of a conservation policy. If you think about a protected area, the environmental savings from a protected area vary hugely across space. And so do the social costs. Those facts alone tell us that if we just think about where we put development policies and where we put conservation policies, smart, informed decisions should do better. And I'll try to show you a bunch of research that supports that. Second line, interactions of policies. It is also totally clear that one policy affects the impact of another. The ones I'll talk about, protected areas affect the impacts of roads. Roads affect the impacts of protected areas. Property rights work better in some governance conditions and worse in other governance conditions. So environmental governance. So if one policy is affecting another policy, it's totally obvious that coordinating them can be more efficient. So obvious and yet not so dumb. So I'm trying to push in that direction. And we have plenty of evidence to go in that way. Are we really going to do joint maximization? The last thing I'll raise is political economy. We don't always, on the environmental side, manage to think about who are the groups who are winning and losing. How do we take that into account to make our wonderful suggestions actually politically feasible? So I want to emphasize variations in impacts, policies interacting with each other, and thinking about the different groups who win and lose. I think those three get us plenty of room for the gains. And then we can do all sorts of stuff, like invent wonderful technologies, but I think this alone would go far. So I'll start with development policies. I'll talk about their impacts on the environment. In particular, I'll start with roads and property rights, and I'll say that their impacts are really different in highly economically developed places and not very economically developed places. Even different signs. If you can have a positive effect or a negative effect, depending on where you go, we really want to pay attention to variation in the impacts of policy. So we'll talk about roads and rights, then get to environmental policies that interact with the development policies. As I previewed, I'll be thinking about protected areas interacting with roads, and I'll be thinking about property rights interacting with environmental governance. Finally, get to the political economy. We've already got environmental interests, we've already got development interests, but I want to bring out the richer, poorer dimension, because this is the SDGs, right? We might be thinking about particular groups of people, not just average income or something like that. When do we want to think about that particular group and how that features or factors in to these impacts that we're trying to coordinate? So I'll be thinking about first, a high-level trade-off between environment and development. We'll talk about when protected areas actually disappear. Turns out protected areas disappear quite a bit. And think about when that happens, and whether we're surprised or not, and if we can understand that and make use of it. And then when do we adjust things for smallholders? When do we treat the more poor groups differently, and how might that adjust the trade-offs that we're making? Those are the places I'll try to go. Please stop me with questions, and we'll see how far I get. Where are we trying to get to? What integrations of policy can actually satisfy the many, many objectives that are implied or even explicit in the SDGs? Okay. See how it goes. Okay, so everybody knows roads cause forest loss, very famous picture, fishbone forest clearing. Okay. Except not really always. So this is not a very charismatic picture, but all I want you to think about is transport costs, low transport costs near the city, high transport costs far out of the frontier. This is simple theory, thinking about different distributions of land quality, that doesn't matter. Punchline, I think most people are thinking about road impacts right about here at the edge of the forest frontier where development is ready to expand. New roads at the edge of the forest frontier absolutely raise deforestation. However, a lot of new roads actually end up being closer to the city where things are already developed. One of the reasons why it's way harder to find road impacts in the data than in what we assume is true is that putting a new road in a place that's already pretty developed may actually not have much impact on the forest at all. And then way more upsetting for ecologists is if I tell you that new roads out in beautiful, pristine forests, now careful with this sentence, don't have much short-run impact. Because someone's about to tell me, and they'd be right, that if you put a road out here in a distant forest, there's a long process where people migrate, and then the state invests, and then people come, and 30 years later the forest is gone. That can happen, that is true. But most of the data we ever have is not 30-year data. And in 5 or 10 years, when there's very few people out here on the frontier, empirically, there's actually not that much forest change. Also, the dynamics can go different ways. Parts of the Trans-Amazon Highway have just vanished because they went to places where no one wanted to go, nobody migrated, nobody maintained the road, and it's gone. So yes, development dynamics are critical, but first, they could be heterogeneous, and second, this might be low for 5 or 10 years, might be really high, might be really low. Okay, that's just simple theory, so what do? Grab data, don't expect you to see these numbers. Happy to tell you about them if you're really fascinated about the colors. But what they tell you is, in early development of the Brazilian Amazon, it's true. Put a road where there's already prior roads or prior deforestation, not much impact. Put a road kind of intermediate where we're ready to explode, boom, impact. Put a road on the far frontier, especially where there's not a lot of deforestation, for 5, 10 years, not a lot of impact. Doesn't mean it's a good idea, but in the data we have, that's true. Problem though, almost all the road literature is about Latin America. So we tend to think, hey, you know what? A lot of them is this middle part, and over time, more places get developed. So yeah, roads can have impacts, except for the whole world is in Latin America. And if we think about China's Belt and Road Initiative, I think China will facilitate investments such as in, a new IRSA, whatever the IRSA is now, in Latin America. But a lot of those investments are elsewhere in the world. So for instance, in Asia. So a PhD student of mine who's now a YP at the World Bank, young professional, says, there's a lot more development on average in India, and huge roads rollout program to get to rural areas for good SDG reasons. I wonder what happens. From the prior work, we might think, geez, pretty highly developed, pretty population dense, maybe the impacts of the roads on the forests are not so high. That's correct. On average, the impact is basically zero in India. No impact of road investments on forests. Rural roads, we can get into the details at any other time. But India is a darn big place, like the Brazilian Amazon. There's a lot of Indias in India. But if you break up by various characteristics of, say, remoteness and good qualities for agriculture, it actually starts to look like the Latin American heterogeneity. And the more isolated places far out, which have sort of medium development, grows lower forests. And the most intensely developed places, roads raise forests. Now, at that point, someone always says, yeah, junk data, I don't believe it couldn't happen. It really could happen. When you put roads in pretty developed places, people leave agricultural rural areas and go to cities. They switch from fuel wood to LPG gas. They switch out of agriculture even locally into small manufacturing. There actually are a lot of dynamics in high developed settings in which it makes sense that in India, at this period of time, post-2000, the road investments actually raised forest. So we have two heterogeneities going on. Regional, Latin America and India are not the same, and within region. Across Latin America is not the same, and it really matters. Across the Brazilian Amazon is not the same. Right? The states in the Brazilian Amazon are huge and incredibly different. Same is true of India. So, all we've talked about so far then is one development policy and one outcome for us. And it's super heterogeneous. So, let's add some more things to think about. Why do we even have those roads in the first place? Most of them are to stimulate economic activity. These are nightlights pictures from India. David and some colleagues also have roads on nightlights work. And recently I had the chance to be at a World Bank workshop to give essentially a risk assessment and a benefits assessment for the China Belt and Road Initiative, right? Huge amounts of investment around the world. On the economic benefits side, they're getting some of the leading sort of trade and trade modelers, some Tony Venables, some McLeod, doing CGE modeling, and this is an example of what they find. Not up here, and I couldn't find the slide, of all the projects that they looked at with this CGE modeling, about half didn't even have any benefits on average. Right, you can do that by building a road that's basically redundant to other transport networks. Right? You can easily spend a lot of money on a transport link that doesn't change effective transport. So maybe half of the projects they evaluated don't have clear economic benefits, which means if they're very costly, they have net costs. And then whenever you look at the pictures of the economic gains, they're incredibly spatially heterogeneous. And not a shock. Two things going on. One, where's the network close to and where is it far from? Two, was the place already prepared to have economic growth? So this is a similar kind of story. If you had some connection, and you had some preparation for economic growth, and a road comes, boom, you could explode. But if you weren't ready with prior preparation, much like deforestation in the far frontier, or if the network didn't really change the investment in a road, or a lot of it's in rail actually, didn't really change that transport cost, you might not have much impact at all. So now we have one development policy, and when we listen to the standard BRI rhetoric, this is what we talk about. What will it do for the economy? So go for the places with bigger gains, less for the places with smaller, forget the projects that don't lose anything. That's sensible, but not really sensible. It's not sensible in my view to only max out on the economic outcomes when you could so easily combine with the environmental outcomes as well. So, for instance, so let's be as simple as you could possibly be, 2 by 2, right? For sure there are road investments that are connecting to areas that are behind or that are redundant, right? They're not really changing. So there's not really any economic benefit, it's low. And we put it in the wrong places out on the frontier, so we get a bunch of deforestation. So can we find projects where you manage to blow up the forest for no economic gains? We can. This is lose-lose, right? Not a good idea. Can we instead think about projects that connect already pretty functional cities but increase their functionality, increase urban growth, that go through already cleared routes so they have almost no forest impact? Actually, I think we can. So even at the simplest level still of one development policy, I'm convinced that if we could just get people to ask, could we somehow just keep the same high economic benefit and just think for a moment to avoid the high environmental damage and move over to prioritize the routes with low environmental damage or here, high environmental benefits? Could we have significant efficiencies in development projects? I'm sure that we can. And that's so obvious that you would probably ask yourself, well, duh, that must already happen. I don't think that's happening, right? I mean, look at the moment, look what's happening in Brazil, right? That is clearly not where we're going, right? Look what's happening in the Chinese application for World Bank funding. It wasn't worried at all about environmental risk. right? So we had to put it in there. I don't even know if it's going to get published. Right? It's very easy to max out on one dimension. And then you say, well, wait, aren't there environmental impact assessments? Yes, and they tend to come after all the important decisions are made. Right? Oh, the road's already here. Let's go put a bridge over so the gazelle can run. Okay, that's good. I like gazelles. But that's not the same answer as moving the road to a place where it's less damaging. Right? Oh, what about strategic environmental assessments? Good, better, a little higher level, but they're not occurring at the point of where are we even considering for our routes? Could someone just even think about the environmental gains and benefits? Could someone do a serious job with the economic gains and benefits and combine those? Again, it's third grade, but you need to get actors with different interests to work together. That's the political economy. If I ask the head at the IDB of sustainable infrastructure, the way he might put it, with a sort of development lens with environment risks, is it's so clear that huge amounts of resources are being invested, ignoring the fact that they're going to get tied up with environmental lawsuits later. I would probably put that differently. I'd like to try to save the environment and get the development, but even if all you want is development and you don't want to get tied up with an environmental lawsuit, you want to think ahead about both dimensions. So this is the simplest point in the world. I'll try to add different cases, and I wish I were wrong. I hope I'm wrong. Please tell me I'm wrong. This is happening. It's being done. I don't think it's being done, but it could be done. Okay. So let's get a little more real. So that was 2 by 2 in general. I think everything we said is roughly right, but in this very 2 by 2 average way. You'd actually have to look at real projects. So a colleague, I didn't do this, when we were doing this input to the bank BRI, looked at a bunch of possible routes for the, I think it's the SIGPEC BRI economic corridor. And I cannot tell you what SIGPEC stands for, but. And here's 3 different routes that are being considered. This way, down to here, straight down, and around. So this would be not only the kind of thing I was talking about, but when my colleague, the ecologist, does this, she points out that right here is a unique habitat for one species. Okay, fine. If it's a small, unique habitat, now we have even more information, you know, and you just go around. It depends, right? And I don't know, for instance, the original definition of what the global environmental facility would pay for was incremental cost. And the way that was defined was, if you were going to do this road, and if doing this road would save the panda, right, of global interest, we will pay the extra or incremental cost of going around it instead of through, right? So when you ask the World Bank for support for the BRI, they should be saying, you know what, we don't really want to support, we're going to actually ask about the environmental damages. We don't really want to support straight through this rare habitat. We would cover the cost of going around, or take this route, or take that route. So there's at least a half-hour picture she has on this one alone that go from this high level down to actually bridges over the highway for the species to go over. So there are things you can do at local level, and we have lovely pictures for this case to show. I'm telling more of a high-level, early planning optimization that I wish were getting done more often. So we can get super real now. There's a lot of lovely pictures from around the world. There's ecologists working everywhere, right? There's carbon scientists everywhere. We can provide this information if the question gets asked early enough. Okay. So all of that was just heterogeneous impacts. If the impact of a policy on the economy varies, if an impact of a policy on the environment varies, it's clear we have a lot of choices to make about where to do these things. So the next thing was policy interactions. The reason the policy impact varies is another policy.
I just have a comment. I mean, I like your case study, but I wonder if we really have the information when we are at those planning stages. Because at least in a Latin American context, those decisions are made, and then eventually when environmental impact assessments or other kinds of assessments pop up and point out many of the problems we are highlighting. So there is like a disconnection between how and when information is produced, what's the quality of that information, and the planning process.
Could you say that again, please? That's exactly what I'm saying. That's exactly right. That is what's happening. So, in case you didn't believe me, believe him. So that's exactly what's happening, right? High-level decision is made. We're going to go here, and then some poor transport engineer looks at you like, "What are you talking about? I'm trying to make sure the oil doesn't fall off onto the duct," which is good, right? But we're not talking anymore about where does it go. That was decided 8 months ago. That's exactly the problem. But, that's the process that is happening. I could give a slightly different answer was, could we have this information at the early stage? 2 answers. Absolutely yes, because a lot of these things we could know. But is it imperfect? Sure. I guess I would say it's pretty clear, it's a lot better than not asking at all. Yeah. But that's exactly what I want to say about what I think is the typical process. So thank you for helping me answer things.
When you have the studies, when you are trying to make a road and you have the studies, the prefecture studies, there's no some information of this type when you are making the studies before doing the road?
So I think they're usually not getting done. I believe that often there is information in the world. The world is not that many untouched places. Thank you. We have a fair bit of information, huge maps from the Wildlife Conservation Society, where are wild places, tremendous maps of hydrological flows around the world. There is a lot of information produced. What I think is happening is the people trying to create a road for a particular set of economic goals, try to solve that problem, which is a very legitimate problem to solve, and do not feel that it is their problem or their job or even their permission to try to solve other questions that maybe someone else decided weren't important enough. So it's very much this high level, what are we going to think about early? And what are we going to either explicitly hide from or just not quite think about? That is the issue. I mean, it's an issue, as is building information. It's a really big thing. So.
I agree that the bigger problem is this strategic not taking into account the environmental cost or the benefits of taking different options. But I also think that we do have a limitation on how we value those costs and benefits, especially environmental ones.
Yes.
In terms of time, when are these impacts going to take place?
Yes.
We have all these, and in that case, we don't know when, but we could know what can happen.
Yes.
But in many cases, we don't even know that, right? So we
Yes.
have these uncertainties. So even if I'm doing a joint maximization,
Yep.
if the lower cost route is run in the middle, and I don't have such a clear information as these very special species or habitat,
Yes.
it might be the case that I do the joint maximization and I still get that one
I agree.
as the best option.
I agree. So I completely agree with what you say. 2 things. Absolutely, we will not have perfect information now. I think probably a larger issue are 2 things. One, how do we handle what you just said? How do we decide to handle that risk? Right? What's the burden of proof? Burden of proof rules are very big in society, right? Like, for instance, you're not going through there until you show me there's nothing damaging, or I'm going through there until you prove to me there is damage. Those are going to get very different outcomes. Both of those rules exist in the world, right? If we think of, for instance, the burden of proof for supply chain certification, which I'll talk more about, and Professor Rueda knows a great deal about, there may be a burden of proof that I'm not paying a premium until you show me how lovely your conditions are. Alternatively, if I'm the United States Lacey Act blocking you or a moratorium, I have to buy it until I prove that you did damage. So those burden of proof, and let's start there, then whose risk preferences? And as you said, whose time preferences? So that's a very nice segue into the political economy of whose interests are we going to give more weight? Because you know that on average, your sort of environmental interest is appearing to implicitly put lower discount rates and more weight on the future, whereas your I want to feed hungry people who won't be around in the future, the high discount rate development is a very different perspective, both legitimate. So that political economy, how do we blend the different perspectives, is going to be critical. I agree. See how people raise their hands? You too can do that. All right, good. Okay, so interactions. So Brazilian Amazon, everyone knows it's a high important place, and everyone knows there was pretty high deforestation, and then post 04 started to go down with a bunch of different policies. It's going back up now. I have the impression that there's less of a sense of the huge heterogeneity across this unbelievably big region. I mean, the Brazilian Amazon roughly is the size of the continental US. It's really big, right? So I think it's 100 Costa Ricas, if I'm not mistaken. So there's this area we might loosely call the arc of deforestation. It's a term that's used. It's the Brazilian Amazon is to the northwest, so it's underneath the region. And then there's, we'll call it the non-arc, and we could fight all day about what that is, doesn't matter. This is roughly a non-arc, further north, further west. Okay? So when we look at protected area impacts in the non-arc, even post-2000, right, when there was really high deforestation, but there's not a lot of roads, right? There's not a lot of prior development pressure out there. If you look at the state of Amazonas, the city of Manaus is a free trade zone. It looks like part of New York City, right? This little bitty dot around which is just forest, right? And Amazonas state, mostly not facing a lot of pressure, right? And many things to comment on that if you're a Brazilian Amazon fan. So do we have impacts from protected areas in this high deforestation time? No. In the non-arc, we don't have impacts. I don't know if you probably can't see this, but this is the zero line for all these. We don't have impacts from indigenous lands, which is, well, maybe not in the current regime, but until now, a pretty heavily defended set of rights. Federal protected areas and state protected areas, none of them. One of the interesting things about having no impacts, which I don't always see people noticing, is that you tend not to have any spillovers. Because if you didn't do anything, no one has to respond. So that turns out to be true. There's no spillover. So when you do a spillover study, try not to include places where there was no impact, which is sadly common with protected areas that get pushed out by development forces. Okay, so do roads affect the impact of protected areas? You're darn right they do. This is a low pressure, low road environment, protected areas, 2000, 2004, 2004, 2008, no statistically significant impact of the protected area. Big ones, right? We always say, wow, a huge fraction of the Amazon is covered by some kind of protected area. Okay, well, not all obviously doing anything. But if we go to the state of Pará, pretty high pressure in the arc of deforestation, these federal, indigenous is a federal agency, but it's different from the environmental agency. These federal areas are lowering deforestation. So, does having pressure and roads, and for that matter, credit, do those things affect the impacts of protected areas? They sure do. They can be more consequential where they're in the action of doing something. Let's flip it. Are these protected areas affecting the impacts of the roads and the credit? Yes, they are. They're lowering them because they're sort of going next door to these development actions so that maybe you can get your development along this line, but maybe you'll sort of keep the development from spreading out and having a lot of deforestation with lower development benefits, right? We're trying to look for that trade-off. So yes, there's a clear interaction between protected areas of conservation investment and roads and development investment. I will just say, depending on how much time we get, and following up a little bit on your question about interests, that standard sort of decentralization or federalism kind of thinking about environmental policy would say that federal policies might be expected to be more consequential for the environment than state policies. States don't have a lot of reason to think about environmental gains for other states. The federation does. And indeed, we find this. So the state actions are less consequential for the environment than are the federal. Perhaps even cooler, in my view, is the spillovers from these two federal actions have the opposite sign. So, and this comes to this issue about whose interests you care about. So in Pará, consequential protected areas, because we're in a place with roads and pressure. Good, I like that. And the federal, let's go with the indigenous, the classic concern is leakage. If you block somebody here, they will go there, right? So here we're only looking for local leakage. Leakage can happen around the world, right? If I block soy in the Brazilian Amazon and the prices rise, someone might produce soy in Australia, if you don't actually know if they do soy in Australia. But there are global market prices, right? They do affect behavior around the world. I'm looking for local spillovers, right next door. And indigenous have leakage, which is to say, yes, you're defending that line, which has been the tradition of indigenous areas in the Brazilian Amazon. But you go right next door, and boy, there's not an inch more, and maybe there's even invasion. And I think this is about this political economy. I think there's a legal restriction to protect those lands, and that's it. Like, we are not doing an inch more than that, and it comes right up to the line, and if you block me, I'm going to clear next door. So indigenous lands have leakage. So whose interest do we care most about? The federal protected areas have something that no one almost ever talks about, what I'll call blockage, or a nice little halo around the area. I won't spend a lot of time on that now. I will just say that one of the stories in my view, and we've tested it, this is Diego Herrera, a PhD student, ex-PhD student now, many jobs later. Not only are protected areas blocking roads impacts, they're actually blocking roads. So road building is lower near these federal PAs than where there aren't federal PAs. And it looks like a political signaling between two agencies battling it out. And I will ask you the question I tend to ask: what is your model of a government? In the economics math textbook, it's a mathematical optimization with two tools that are perfectly harmonized. An alternative model of government is two agencies with completely different agendas fighting it out for the attention of the boss. In the US, the Ag Department and EPA. I think in Brazil, they just moved the environment into the Ag Department, right? Which tells you we think they didn't think they had the same goals. I don't think I've ever seen anyone vote for anything other than option two, right? Two agencies battling it out, right? So what I think is happening here is when the environmental agency wins out and gets a protected area, it essentially sends a signal the development benefits of new roads are going to be lower, and the roads actually get built less. So there's this very clear interaction between types of policies. Let me just say, that is not cooperative, I don't think, at the moment. I think what's happening is it's a battle. If I win the battle, if I get the protected area, you might back off on the road. If I win the road, you might back off. That's all good, and I'm going to show you something later in which contestation might get you efficiency. I am an economist after all, right? But I actually think that cooperation could be way less costly and way more efficient. So I'm still looking naively to turn the world into that joint maximization problem, right? And there was a hand here. Did you have a hand? Sorry. Oh, just got the way.
It was me, yeah.
I need to see what else.
There are many contexts, and like forest frontier context, in which, for example, the scenario you're presenting here assumes that there is like a monopoly of road construction by the state. And there are many instances where private actors just go in, they open roads,
Agreed.
and they don't have any accountability. They just do whatever they want.
Agreed.
How would you take into account that?
Sure. By the way, I didn't give him any of these questions. So thank you again, because what you have just led me to do is to tell you about Diego's other PhD thesis paper, which involves private decisions. It's not private road building, but in fact, we hope to go that way with Amazon, who have fantastic data sets. At the moment, they're kind of caught up trying to monitor. One thing they can do is migrate. And as they're doing that, that's often part of building these little roads. So I will have you know that, think about it, as you say, do what you want, right? So my hypothesis was, when there's a sort of agency level contestation, and we win out and we go with a big protected area, that might well signal, you know what, the top dog and say, we're going green there. We're not doing the same kind of investments by Bay and AS that we do in a lot of other places, right? And we're not going to do the same kind of credit subsidies that we do in other places. So if you're a private actor and you're asking yourself, should I incur the cost of cutting primary forest, which is a pain, right, and migrating to where there's no one there, which is a pain, right? You might get some land eventually, right? You get a deed. Do you go in the place where the next 10 years are going to have more roads, schools, subsidies, or do you go in the place that might have less? I'm going to guess your standard micro model says go where they might have more. And what we found is that migration also moves away when you see these signals. So that's a fantastic question. I completely agree with you. We need to think about all the actors doing their thing and how we're going to have these combinations of policies to get them all going in the right direction. Thank you. Okay. So that is protected areas interacting with roads. I'm looking at the time. Someone tell me if I'm going too far. Yeah, okay, I'll just say the last word on roads. As we then gave input to things you could imagine doing around BRI, China BRI investments, yeah, you could get all this information that you all made good comments about, but also you can very easily think about flanking the roads with protected areas next to them. Then you know they're next to a road, and you know the road has a protected area next to it. And then you can imagine when you have a limited appetite for public land, as different political scenes do, you might go to giving incentives on private land. For China, I say mandatory PES because, let's take your point on people who do what they're interested in. My own impact evaluation sort of sense in my own work is that the fact that people volunteer for PES tends to mean that PES doesn't achieve that much. Short order, I volunteered to be paid for things I was going to do anyway. So, very effective, however, is the Chinese PES, in which I am told, I cannot personally verify this, that it wasn't exactly voluntary. When you have erosion off high slopes going down to cause flooding, going to really big cities, someone at the top says, this is really not a good outcome. We are going to those slopes. You are going to stop agriculture. On the good side, what they say is that the transfers that they gave people more than compensated the losses. So people did win in cash, but it did not appear to be affected by the, I'm going to volunteer in. I mean, they might have volunteered in, but, right, time to volunteer, right? So this PDS actually is known for having, as I understand the evidence, considerable impact. So you can imagine your development action, your sort of broad spatial public action, and then where it's important, you're sort of more targeted. It's a private land, but we have a public thing to say, like we'll pay you to stop. Okay. Those are the kind of things we think, those combinations, which integrations of policies could actually work. That's the question I think we would like to ask. Now, it doesn't mean we can realistically implement it, but let's at least start asking it and push it. Okay. We have a hodgepodge of other examples now as we go. So because I was starting with forests, I do think it's really easy to underestimate the power of property rights. Right? You don't kind of see them, it's not a road. But I think property rights are really quite important for affecting private decisions. So the really big development policy in forests is concessions. And I think the average tendency is to think about a concession, which is of course a license to cut trees, as just a tree massacring place, right? And that's of course sometimes that happens. So we happen to do some work in Cameroon, and in fact, in this particular setting, and as people point out, and quite the point of getting information is these contexts vary tremendously. I'm going to show you some more variation in the smaller space in a moment. But here's 5 different regions, the ones that have concessions. There's more in Cameroon. In Cameroon, and we looked at concessions, and we looked at protected areas. Protected areas actually never had a positive impact. And if I ask people, are they surprised to go to Cameroon? They are not. Interestingly, concessions, if anything, appear to have lowered deforestation. Is that crazy? That's not crazy at all. Right there, potentially that's a highly capitalized actor who has the right to extract that natural resource over time. That's a really good incentive to keep people out. Quite different from, say, your underpaid protected area guard who doesn't really get very much from keeping people out, may not have very many resources. But why did I put it up when I'm talking about interactions or heterogeneity of impacts? Concessions, most of the concessions around here, they didn't have any significant change in terms of deforestation rate. Already that's interesting, you might expect it to be higher. Here in the littoral, where there's higher pressure, again, higher pressure, something going on that could be blocked, the private concessions lower deforestation rate. Okay? So, again, it's really different to do a policy, development or environment, in a place with a lot of action, a place with sort of intermediate action, and a place with not a lot of action. Right? As you said, the contexts are super different. Right? So here, leading development policy, significantly heterogeneous impacts. When there's pressure, you can block it.
Could you explain a little how the concessions work? Could you explain a little how the concessions work?
Oh yeah, thank you, sorry. So it's a property right or an extraction right, a right to use. We would lay out on a map or some form of communication with space. This area, you have the sole right to extract timber. Sometimes there's a management plan that moves it around subsets of that space. It's usually for a period of time, could be 10 years, could be 30 years. There's interesting questions about aligning that with the tree growth rate for the efficient growth and cutting. And so a concession would be the government of Cameroon says to a firm, in this area, right here, you have the right to extract the timber and to keep other people out for the next 30 years. And so, in principle, the fact that it's my timber in the future would lead me to want to let it grow optimally and not cut it early before it grows, keep you from taking it. Various private actions, as we're highlighting, that could, even though they're all for timber, depending on the background context, that could be pro-forest, whereas in other settings I'm about to show you, that could actually clearly raise the deforestation rate. Okay, so this is my second development policy. The first was roads, second is concessions. This is just heterogeneity under pressure. Low pressure is different from high. So what about interactions? Let's now go to Peru, moving Amazon. So we're going to look at Loreto, Ucayali, I don't know why that's not up here, somehow I erased it, and Madre de Dios. Three different, again, these are quite large regions. Loreto is really quite large. And we're going to ask if concessions interact have the same effect in the three areas. None of them are super high pressure. Loreto in particular is low. So let's look at the results. And this is following up on the question you had. So Loreto, there's just not much going on, much like in that eastern part of Cameroon in terms of pressure. And it's interesting to know, though, that a lot of concessions are not statistically significantly different from background deforestation. Again, we sort of have to get our head around what are the incentives of the actor. Yes, it's to cut down trees, but it's also to get the most tree out of this plot over time. That's a particular set of incentives. Now, at Ucayali, which some people say a little bit more Wild West governance, again, I personally cannot confirm, and these, by the way, are not huge differences. I will use them to be illustrative. The small red number is to indicate that the concessions in Ucayali have more deforestation than the background rate. Right? And it could easily be that you give someone a concession for, say, 5 years, and they want to cut everything they can by the end of the 5 years. Like you can get wiped out in concessions for sure, depending on the incentives you create with the rules you make. Right? On the other hand, in Madre de Dios, which has been a real conservation focus, has a fair bit of civil society, international funding, even the concessions have slightly lower deforestation, much like that one in Cameroon to the east. Not so much from pressure, the story that I'm told is more attention to enforcement. There's just more interest in playing sort of green dimension of development. Okay, so since I will be limited in time, I will just also say then, if this is a place where you're more tightly controlling your concession, and this is a place where you're less tightly controlling it, And now we want to think about a way that's getting ever bigger in the world, in which we combine development and environment, which I think of as supply chain governance or sort of environmental standards. Again, Commander Rueda knows a lot about this for someone here. You want to follow up, just giving you a lot of office hours. Where do you think a certification where you say, I confirm that the production process for timber was cleaner here, and you send that message up to retailers and consumers, in which area do we think it would have more impact? My own sense is that very good control of your own concession is essentially a necessary condition to start to play nuanced games like, oh, I'm going to send a signal through an NGO who's going to monitor me, and I'm going to be able to verify to people in other markets that I did the right thing. So my prior seeing this was that if anywhere we might have a small impact of Forest Stewardship Council certification of timber here, I will say it's quite small. I think there's a lot of reasons why those certifications don't have impact. But it does happen to be true that the only region we found even a small positive impact was Madre de Dios. Now let me step back. For someone who likes empirical proof, that was a weak empirical statement I just gave you. But I still want to illustrate for you that you really, when you think about how do we combine conservation and development, you have to ask, who are those actors? How are they performing? What are their interests? Are these folks playing a different game from these folks? And if they are, then bringing in your environmental signal to consumers is not going to work the same in this context as in that. Like I think conservation is suffering and limited around the world because of a lack of understanding and engagement with development. And there's really good reasons for that. No one's asking conservationists to figure out where the roads go. But it is a tremendous limit on us, which is sort of what got me into trying to push towards, could we ever get anyone to integrate these decisions? Okay, so I want to say two things before I get to political economy. One, development policies have heterogeneous impacts. Roads do, concessions do. Two, environmental initiatives interact with development policies to change their impacts. Protected areas and roads, think of this as environmental governance and rights. And even if you've got all that, then we come to that sort of red question mark on my first page. Are we really going to get joint maximization? And who are we going to think about? Whose interests are we going to consider? When is the default political process going to blend those things? And when are we going to have to try really hard to get it to combine them? So that's going to be the process. So please feel free to cut it out. When do we combine them? Oh, sorry, let me see here. Let me skip that. Okay. Okay. So now I'm going to try to go to the political economy side in the sense of, does attention to a specific group, including a poorer group, change our perspective on which policy combinations and integrations we might want? Okay? And I will argue that quite often it could. So here's a very practical one. We're staying in the Peruvian Amazon, same exact picture, just smaller. Still doesn't say Upiale or Madre Dios, but they're up there. And we're going to ask a different question. What if we have a conservation-oriented policy, like the protected areas that I mentioned for Cameroon, but I haven't mentioned yet for Peru, but we're really interested in smallholders. We want to not kick everybody out necessarily. We might want to let some smallholders into an extractive reserve, right? There's any number of types of protected areas, but if we might think of strict protected areas and multiple use protected areas. Where in multiple use, we might allow legally for some clearing and extraction inside that reserve. And you might immediately think, wait a second, you're going to allow extraction inside the reserve. So you're already telling me it's going to have less impact. And the answer is no. There's a number of times when it actually has more impact. And I'll put a couple of these up and try to explain why I think that's happening. There's two different stories, one for Peru and one we'll see back for the Brazilian Amazon. So when we start to think about treating smallholders and what are their decisions, I think it can sometimes change our balance on the environment development policy combination. So here's the evidence that I'll throw up for you. Yeah, let's just do the theory for a moment. Why did all those protected areas not have so much impact? So first order, we can look globally, and there's been plenty of papers and papers imitating those papers. Protected areas get pushed away to places where there isn't a lot of development. They say, sure, you can have your protected area, go put it there where I don't care. So that's kind of the story of protection around the globe. Right? There's a bias towards places where people are like, yeah, that's nice, very nice. And then you look at it, and you take a picture with beautiful remote sensing, and it's 100% forest. And you think, success. The answer is no, because you're so far out there that if you walk outside the protected area, it's also all forest, right? There's just no difference. So there's a lot of that in the world. Okay, so would it make a difference to say, hey, let's just do the Chico Mendes Extractive Reserve story. Hey, rubber tappers, you're allowed to have a little bit of extraction from this area. How do you feel about having a protected area now? All of a sudden, there's a bunch of people who actually have some rights and get something out of it and might be a lot happier to have a protected area in a place where it's actually consequential. In fact, I have a paper where we took that idea and looked around the world for places where essentially smallholders cut a deal with the state, and they say, hey, I got a deal. You block all these highly capitalized big landholders, you let me in, I will monitor, I will only extract a little bit, and we will be a politically feasible coalition where you save the environment, I get you a little bit of eating, and we keep out those large landholders. That's actually what a lot of things look like. A lot of MPAs, a lot of protected areas around the world look like that. There are even some here in Colombia, I'm told. So, what about it? That's not always the case. What happens in the Peruvian Amazon? Let's just get to the data. There we go. Okay, so if we look at strict protected areas, actually, in Madre Dios, they're a little bit higher than background deforestation. In Loreto, they're a little lower. In Cayali, no big deal. So strict protected areas, on average, especially since Loreto is huge, they're doing something. How much they're doing was the whole study area. That's why we have that row. Okay. Those are the kick everybody out, which is easy to think will be the more environmentally consequential. These are the direct use, the multiple use. Region, these are statistically identical. Higher, higher, on the whole, quite a bit higher. Something funny about that one. So I have no idea what that is. Higher, higher. Get the bottom row. By region, the multiple use protected areas save more forest. And you have to ask yourself, how does that happen? How is it that letting people cut trees saves trees? Because you're right, that if it were in the same place and you had the same monitoring, it wouldn't work. So those are the two keys. As Joe Albers has pointed out, she's an EFT person, around the globe, local folks can help monitor. Right? We got satellite data now, we can actually make cell phone calls, we can report incursions. You don't even have to take someone on and get shot. Right? But there's very clear incentives for local people to help monitor and report invasions. And is the default for a big empty area, otherwise known as a strict area, is invasion. If that's the default, monitoring is helpful. The other story is location. Ken Chalmers did a study globally a long time ago. The Chico Mendes Extractive Reserve is an example. Multiple use protected areas are closer to roads and closer to cities. They should be. They're multiple use. They're allowing existing people to come in. They're where people are. And they're giving them some local benefits. So how do you pull off protection in a place where there's some action and you can really make a difference? Maybe provide some local benefits in a multiple use protected area, right? Actually not so different from a concession, to be honest, right? Just a small, limited one. So we think about who are the actors, how do we get these blends of development and environment? What will they choose under different policy designs? And here's one kind of story. And I will put this up. Having said that, I'll just make it even more explicit because I'm being super simple today, and I apologize if overly simple and overly repetitive. It's supposed to be an opinion talk, so I just keep saying my opinion. Okay, so there's this mitigation hierarchy. You can say, oh, mitigation hierarchy. If you're going to have a project, let's mitigate its damages. Here's a hierarchy: avoid, reduce, restore, offset. Okay, what's that? Avoid, don't do the damage. That works. Reduce, do less damage. That works. Less. Restore, put it back, right? And just wait to fight with the ecologist about whether you really put it back. Right? And then offset. So handy dandy. So in the US, we have things like the no net wetland loss policy. So no net. Net is a very important term here. You can get rid of a beautiful wetland. You just need to put another one back. And now just think about how incredibly well monitored the eco-services are, right? Not, right? So you can pretty much like take a hose, show it in some mud, and go, oh, it's wet, right? And like in a way, that's basically true, right? And it's not replacing the ecological services of what you destroyed. So the whole offset thing, destroy it here, fix it there, there's some real challenges there, I guess I would say. I don't think it's impossible, but what you tend to get is George W. Bush just made the biggest protected area everywhere. It turns out it would take you like 9 days by boat to get to it. It's a marine protected area somewhere in the middle of the Pacific Ocean. Okay, well, maybe it's blocking something, but since no one can get there, maybe not, right? So you tend to get, oh, I did some damage, look, bang, a green spot on the map, protected area, except for really easy for then everyone to stop monitoring, and it's not really doing so much. So I'm going for the avoid version. In the stories we just heard, how do you get protection in the action? Think about dealing with the local folks. This is the Chico Mendes Extractive Reserve. This is the Interoceanic Highway. How many protected areas do you know that are right next to significant transport routes? Not that many. But this one got pulled off, more or less. It was actually even advocated for. I believe the Extractive Reserve was invented in Brazil as a smallholder protection program. No joke. Protected area invented as a smallholder protection program. Protection from whom? Large holders, right? So think about the political economy, which groups benefit, especially because you say we're talking about SDGs, which tends to be the smaller, poorer groups. Right? Okay, so I'm ranking option 2 to try. Okay. One more. Or at least one more. So what about if large development has significant bargaining power? Has that ever happened? Have very large corporations ever dictated to agencies? Yes. Was Blair Omaji the governor of Mato Grosso? Yes, and also the head of the soy herd. Right? So there's just endless cases in which we know there's significant bargaining power. Has Sao Paulo ever had blackouts? Yes, when there's rain problems. So who has political power? In Brazil, people who produce power, right? So if you want to have bargaining power, start producing electricity. What's one way to do that? Dams, right? Brazil is huge on hydropower. Very large fraction of electricity is hydropower. So if you want hydropower, you're looking good in the whole agency bargaining thing. So how do you end up integrating environment and development in that setting? Because maybe there's only one set of interests being taken into account, right? So there's no joint maximization at all. Or is there? So some folks at Conservation International have been collecting information on PAD, or what I say, PAD, which is protected area, degazettement, to degazette or to eliminate the protected area, downsizing, to shrink the protected area, and downgrading to make it a lower status of protection. So they've been collecting data on PAD events for quite a long time. Mike Masha is the person who started it. He's now the head of science in CI. There's been a lot of PAD around the world. I did not know that. I knew that in the U.S., indigenous reservations were wiped out, but it turns out there's a lot of PAD around the world. So he said, let's come look at the data. Let's look at Brazil. So I'm sure that'd be fun. Let's see what we can find. And amazingly, Rondônia, which is kind of known to be like the Wild West of the Brazilian Amazon, not obviously conservation oriented, maybe not shockingly, had a bunch of PAD events in 2009 and another group in 2014. 2009 tended to list hydropower as the major proximate cause, right, as we were talking about. So there's a picture of where the PAD events were. Let's see if I can remember. I can't read that, but anyway, there's we had mostly degazettements and a couple downsizes. So then I thought about this bargaining story that I was telling you about roads. And I thought to myself, if you are going to lose, right, they've got the power, so to speak, right, because they're producing the power. What would you do if you were the environmental agency in a competitive bargaining setting? And what I thought was, I would give you the protected area that's doing least for me, right? So what is that? So that could be the one with my least favorite bird, right? Maybe. And you know, people have views about favorite species. But then I thought, you know, this is fantastic because these happened in 2009. And that lovely Hansen data set for deforestation around the world starts in 2000. So I thought, I know some of these have been invaded. So if I'm the Environment Agency, I'm thinking the ones that have already failed and been invaded and been deforested, let's give a definition, where the internal deforestation rate is darn close to the external deforestation rate, right? I'm thinking I go in there and say, you know, okay, take it, right? Because he's basically already gone. And if you can get away with that being what you give up, you're doing well. So what do? We took these, this is now a pure aspect version, and ran regressions, and indeed, the prior deforestation predicts PAD. So it looks like development's got the power, environment's basically playing defense, like it's playing black in chess or something. Like, what do? You try to push it to where it's least loss for you. Sort of even cooler. The story was, according to CI Brazil, that the decision had already been made by 06. So then we broke up the deforestation rate to pre-06 and post-06. And indeed, it's only the pre-06 deforestation that has predictive power for PAD. So it looks like you're kind of revealing the decision process with the deforestation data, right? So that's kind of cool. But then we also have some downsizes. And I hope I've upsized this picture enough that you can almost see it. There were 2 downsizes at this time, and they shrunk. And we thought this is the beauty of very spatially intense data. We can look inside a protected area and look at the part that was downsized and the part that wasn't. So what do you think happened? In both cases, the part that was maintained had no deforestation, the red line. And the part that got cut out was the one that already had spiky deforestation. So it actually looks like, depends how you want to say this, competitive bargaining or almost rationality. So, but it wasn't by cooperation. It almost looks like rational bargaining. And a really good way to get shot in the ecology conference is to start suggesting trading protected areas for other places, right? Although climate change can sometimes make you think about that. But there's a way in which this looks like rational bargaining, and we can think about how do we best accommodate. This is a tough question. I'm not saying we have the answer, but it looks like the competitive version already is making trades between development gains and environmental losses. So couldn't the cooperative version do at least as well, and probably at a lot lower cost? You know, again, maybe not under this regime, but you know, things change over time. So I'm going to stop in just a couple of minutes. So let me do a speculative one, just for Professor Rueda, because she doesn't have enough visitors yet. Okay. So here's a speculative integration. Another story where there's beef development. Very large firms in Brazil in the beef and soy supply chains. BNDES, if I'm not mistaken, you confirm, has given huge development subsidies to these firms, which already have market power, including low-cost loans. So you've got big power, good economic power, subsidies, a big development, right? Because this is sort of a champion for Brazil. They export a lot of meat, they made a lot of cash. It's a winner. And considerable forest clearing. So there's the sort of development goal side. And in many ways, it's working. Soy too. But on the other hand, the U.S. is a pretty darn large market also for some of these things. they may have environmental preferences. So you see some of these zero deforestation commitments. We don't want to buy it if it came from a place with deforestation. And this is in soy. Professor Rita has worked quite a bit on coffee. And a moratoria, you cannot bring it in if you have the wrong environmental conditions. So you're trying to allow for this nice development policy, but just interact it with just a little environmental twist to put it in the right places. It's a totally reasonable idea. And the reason I want to use this last is to bring in again this SDG story. These are big firms getting pretty big handouts. And one reason, and I'm not saying it's true here because I'm not the expert in this case, but one reason that large firms sometimes agree to high environmental standards is to get rid of the competition. Because if I'm a big firm and I can handle the costs and the capital and the paperwork and the lawyers, and I already have people in Brasilia doing deals, I can sort of pull this off. Whereas a lot of smallholders who are trying to sell cheap and undercut my nice market power, it's a lot harder for them perhaps to get certified. So certification is a very nice competitive weapon sometimes. But again, just like in multiple use protected areas, the state doesn't have to remain silent, right? You could have combinations in which you get different outcomes. And I call this speculative. I don't know if you've seen this yet. I've heard people talk about it, so I'm just going to make up that it could happen and suggest that maybe sometimes it should. So if you have this very intense block, and what it says is, on your land, beef supply chain producer, you're not allowed to have deforested since, say, 2009. So by the way, you tend not to be, it's actually pretty hard work checking who owns what land and when was it deforested. I mean, seriously, really serious work. But what if I don't check the person who sells to me? What if there's a calf fattening operation that sells to my processing operation, and I'm doing everything right, except for that we're kind of sneaking in the damage in the back door? You know that can happen. And folks who have studied this have some papers saying that at least sometimes happens. I'll leave it to more expert to go further than that. But what do? Maybe you need to expand the rules to a broader area. Like maybe a whole county is going to be deforested. Then you can't have leakage there. Or a whole state in the Brazilian Amazon. And if you do that, if you say, you know what, I'll work with you, state. Let's make our whole state a green market. It'll be good for all of us. The state could then say, you know what, and you're also going to have 20% smallholders. And you know what you're going to do? You're going to help them comply. Because by the time you did the software to fill it in and the monitoring, you could just do it by, just donate it to these guys. So much economies of scale, clearly, in qualifying for these things. There's no reason in my mind, I'll make it up, it's fine, might never happen, that by the time you try to avoid leakage and go jurisdictional, the state can't do something distributional too. And say, yeah, I'm helping, and you're going to have a smallholder share, a quota, or whatever it is. Which, by the way, we don't get around quotas too. But just to raise the issue that you can imagine integrations of policies where you're thinking about nice development, you're throwing on an environment, you're worried about the poor, we can have twists to deal with that too. So if we ask early enough, what about the environment question to go with development? And if we ask at some point, what about the smallholders? I'm convinced there are way more integrated combinations to satisfy a lot of objectives than we currently see. And that is where I will leave it.
I think we have time for one or two questions.
So on that,
The microphone.
Yes.
So, on that last speculation, I was reminded of Whole Foods. So Whole Foods is getting a lot of market share. And what they're doing a lot is that they're bringing in a lot of their organic food from China. So they are taking the reduction in the costs, plus getting market power and putting all those together and getting a greater market share. I think that's very consistent with that story. And so this is more of a very regressive risk in the sense that these firms are going to put a lot of sunk costs into investing in advertisement, the typical IO model of investing in advertisement to position themselves as green, getting a certification and kicking out the rest of the competition.
Yes.
So with the research agenda then on that particular place is how much money are they spending supposedly on getting certifications, alliances with the big certificate agencies.
Yeah.
But in that sense, it's basically investing money as some costs in this just to get very market share.
Yeah.
Is that what you're suggesting in general overall and not only for forest products and these kind of things? In general in all the industries?
Suggesting that it should happen or that it is?
That it is
Yeah,
happening.
okay, exactly. I was not suggesting it should. Yeah, yes, I think, I just, by way of, I think a PhD student graduating now is literally doing IO models. And in particular, looking at the rise of platforms like Walmart and like Amazon that sell many goods to the consumer, which makes them really, really good. And when someone raises their costs, they can threaten that person, well, you can raise your price to me and I'll just push the consumer over here. So I'm not really sure you want to raise your price to me. You might want to eat that cost. So that not only is there already the classic IO you're talking about, I invest in knowing the market and you don't know it, but now even with these multi-product platforms, I think it's making it even harder to push the cost upwards. Instead, because I can substitute for you, I push the cost downward on you.
Thank you. So the first question or comment that I would like to pose is that in order to merge these two agendas, the environmental and the economic agenda, how can we make environmental issues material to other agendas, to the development agenda? And in working, for instance, in infrastructure, like the extra costs and the risks that are implied if you don't take into account the environmental structure of an area. And we're working in, I work for WWF, and what we're working at is trying to find ways where we can make this materiality evident,
Yes.
so that we can sit at the table and talk as peers, more than just like, yeah, we have to make something about the environment.
Yeah, I agree with that fully. The comment by the, sorry. That last point you made, and just to say, I'm often trying to work hand in hand with the folks who provide this information like the ecologists. It's just that they know more about that than I do. The comment I made about Graham Watkins, the IDB sustainable infrastructure person, I think is sort of the starting point, and you used it, which is, we're coming after you with a lawsuit, right? You're trying to get that information up front. You're trying to get the attention of those who are above these banks. At the moment, it's not obvious the U.S. is leading, say, the World Bank in a pro-environmental direction, right? But at least raising that we have this information, we know there's these damages, we have processes by which we can try to cause costs for you. Couldn't we just do this in a more cooperative way up front? I do think that's precisely the challenge. And people have different views. Do you, like my former student who wants to be in the World Bank, trying to bring that in from the inside, right? Graham in the IDB, trying to raise the new infrastructure program. Others trying to publicize very loudly and very widely the potential consequences they see. Let's think of Bill Lawrence, actually. You'll see his alert emails constantly saying this road project is coming, getting ever larger distribution, trying like heck to get someone to raise that, sit as equals, or at least take our information and think about avoiding damages for no large costs to start that discussion. I don't want to be naive and say it's easy to do, but I would say that I think we're too easily accepting processes that we know are failing, instead of pushing it up to one that sometimes can have a much larger gain.
You talk about some development policies that are related to the environment, for example, roads. But what about development policies such as social protection policies that are not so clearly related with the environment? Have you worked on that kind of development projects, policies? I don't know, cash transfer, something like
Yeah,
that.
oh, sure, yeah. Yeah, so I think it's great you raised that. I've only worked so much on it. I will say there is work, say, on environmental implications of oportunidades in Mexico, cash transfers. I think the result there is the extra income leads to degradation. I think the Jennifer Alex Garcia result is that if you're rural in Mexico and high in PES, people go buy more beef and milk from next door and there's more degradation. So income can go both ways. We also know that income can allow people to make investments that are more pro-forest. And I actually think one reason I mentioned property rights is that I think a very, very large social protection policy is rights. And that can very easily change the incentives to play longer run in conservation of the ecology.
I think we have to close with that question. Thank you very
Thank
much.
you.